my supporters. Today I'm going to show you the things that you should change to improve the security posture of your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So I'm logged into the Azure portal where I opened Microsoft Entra ID, and I'm going to guide you through the process of improving the security posture of your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. The overall security posture and the capabilities that you can actually configure within Microsoft Entra ID tenant depends also on the licenses you have available. So for example, if you have only Office 365 services with no Entra ID premium license, you won't be able to change some of the settings that I'm going to show you. On the other hand, if you have premium plan 2, you get the most out of it. Let's start with users. There are some settings that you should change for your users and user accounts. Let's start with password reset. In general, I recommend using password reset because it can also decrease the amount of requests your help desk gets from end users when they are unable to log in due to either forget password or for instance, because their account is locked. If you enable self-service password reset, you can then also integrate it with the login screen in Windows 10 or Windows 11. Self-service password reset in general allows end users to do password reset on their own without contacting your internal IT. By default, self-service password reset is disabled. I in general recommend enabling it. You can either enable it for all users or just selected groups. There are some organizations that obviously have requirements such as that it needs to be managed by the internal IT team. That's completely fine, I totally get it. But for especially smaller organizations, it's usually beneficial if they enable self-service password reset. When you enable self-service password reset, it's very important to configure the authentication methods that are required in order to perform self-service password reset. By default, only one authentication method is required. I in general recommend requiring 2 authentication methods. On the registration page, you configure how often you want to ask users to confirm the multi-factor authentication settings. Because, for instance, the phone number may change over time. And if they don't change it for self-service password reset and multi-factor authentication, they won't be probably able to finish self-service password reset if needed. If you set it to 0, it means that reconfirmation will not be required. For some organizations, it's not needed, especially those smaller that can manage it via their admins, or the admins can manage it for them. For most organizations, it's probably recommended to configure something like 1 a year. So every year, users will be asked to confirm that the authentication methods that they have registered are still valid. In the notification part, by default, it's configured like this. I definitely recommend notifying all administrators when other admins reset their password. The reason for that is that administrators are the most sensitive accounts in your organization, and if a threat actor would be able to get access to an administrator account via, for instance, self-service password reset, the threat actor would be probably able to gain control over your environment. That's the reason why it's so important to notify all other administrators when some admin resets his or her password. So definitely change it to yes. With this setting, whenever an admin role resets password via self-service password reset, all other admins will be notified via email. The other part of the user settings configures default user role permissions. Because by default, in my opinion, users have more permissions than they necessarily need. For example, by default, it looks like this. So it's completely the opposite of what I usually recommend. So by default, users can register applications. That's something that users should not be able to do, so definitely turn it off. Users are able to create tenants with their corporate Microsoft Entra ID identity. So then there will be other tenants associated with your corporate identity that you will not have under your control. Again, something that's definitely not recommended, so you should turn it on because it says restrict. Sometimes it's quite confusing. The last setting here in this first part is users can create security groups. In my opinion, again, it's not necessary. Users can create Microsoft 365 groups, and that should be all they need. Security groups are usually used to assign permissions or access somewhere, and only admins should be able to do that. So I recommend turning it off. Next part is guest user access. By default, it's configured like this. So guest users have the same access as members. It means that guest users can also see other members, can see the properties of their objects, contact information, and so on. My recommendation is to change it to that guest users can see only their own objects. So guest users won't be able to see any other objects in your Microsoft Entra ID. Next part is access to the admin center, because by default, again, it's configured like this. So end users are able to open Microsoft Entra ID Center and see most of the settings here, and also all users, read the properties of users, and so on. Again, in my opinion, it's overprivileged and you should restrict it. So turn it on, which means that end users will not be able to access Microsoft Entra ID admin portal. LinkedIn accounts, I don't have any recommendation here actually. I think it's fine if users are able to connect their LinkedIn accounts with their Microsoft Entra ID accounts, but you can turn it off, definitely. Last part here is show keep user signed in. This setting is sensitive when you allow authentication from unmanaged devices via web applications or web browsers. Because imagine a situation that a user uses their own computer, personal computer that's not managed, or even worse, they sign in via web browser on a foreign computer, like a friend's computer or a shared computer in a coffee shop or hotel or somewhere. By default, this is enabled. It means that the keep me signed in checkbox is available on the login screen. If the user checks the checkbox, it means that the web browser stores something that's called persistent cookie. It's called persistent because it survives closing the web browser and even restarting the computer actually. It means that if the user forgets to sign out and just closes the browser thinking that it's okay, I closed the browser so everything is gone, if the keep me signed in checkbox was checked, the persistent cookie is still present, and when someone else comes to the computer, opens the web browser and goes to some of the Entra ID integrated websites such as Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and so on, the original user will be automatically signed in via the persistent cookie. So it's very risky, and I definitely recommend turning it off. It doesn't affect your corporate devices because on corporate devices you have single sign-on experience. Users are automatically signed in to the cloud services in the web browser via the primary refresh token they get when they sign in to the computer. So for the corporate machines, there is no effect at all. This just affects unmanaged machines. And in my opinion, on unmanaged machines, it shouldn't be allowed to keep corporate user accounts signed in permanently. So turn it off. That's all for the user part. Let's talk about external identities. There is one thing that I always recommend changing. If you go to cross-tenant access settings and check the default settings, in general it's okay. There is just one thing I recommend changing, and it's in the inbound settings. So click the edit inbound defaults, go to trust settings and turn this on, because by default it's all turned off. But I recommend turning the Trust Multi-Factor Authentication for Microsoft Entra Tenants option on. The reason for that is that if you keep it off, it means that external users, when they are accessing your environment, because for instance you share something with them via OneDrive or SharePoint Online, they are asked, or they are actually required to enroll again to MFA in your tenant, even though they are enrolled to MFA in their home tenant. Because by default, your tenant doesn't trust the MFA from any external tenant. So the first reason is it's inconvenient for end users if they are accessing your tenant. But the second, even more important reason is that it's less secure actually. Many customers think that it's more secure if they require external users to register again in their tenants. But the opposite is true actually. The reason for that is that when users register in your tenant, which is called the resource tenant, they cannot register the most secure MFA methods. For instance, Windows Hello for Business is technically not possible, but it's available in their home tenant. So when you allow external users to authenticate with their home tenant MFA, it actually improves the security of external access to your tenant. Because you can then enforce even the authentication methods that are not available in the resource tenants. Sorry, there was one more thing. External collaboration settings. We talked about this guest user access, so I will skip it. Let's talk about the guest invite settings. By default, it's configured like this. So anyone in the organization can invite guest users, including guests. It means that even guests can invite other guests. And it can get easily out of control, so definitely not recommended. I always recommend changing it to at least member users and users assigned to specific admin roles can invite guest users. That means that your internal users can invite guests, which means that your internal users, for instance, can share files on OneDrive or SharePoint Online externally without any external users, but external users are unable to share the files with other external users, for example. Of course, for some organizations, they want to have it under their control, so they change it to, for instance, this, so that only specific admin roles can invite external users, or they disable it completely. But in general, I recommend changing it to at least the second option here. Enable guest self-service sign up via users flow. It's off by default, and I recommend keeping it off unless you have specific needs for self-service sign up for external users. External users leave settings. It's on by default, and I recommend keep it on, because if you turn it off, and you invite an external user because, for instance, you share something with the external user won't be able to leave the organization, which usually there is no need for blocking and external users to leave your organization. And one last thing here is linked subscriptions. If you have an Azure subscription available in your tenant, and if you have less than 10,000 of internal users, or more specifically 10,000 of internal licenses, it's recommended to link your Azure subscription with Entra ID. The reason for that is that by default, your internal licenses allow you to license with the same features up to 5 external users per 1 internal license. It's this ratio. It means that if you have 10 internal Entra ID Premium P1 licenses, that allows you to use conditional access policies for your internal users. The 10 internal licenses allow you to use the same features for up to 50 external users. So then you can configure conditional access policies also for external users up to 5 times more than you have internal licenses. But if you link your Azure subscription, you change the billing model or the licensing model for external users from this fixed 1:5 ratio to something that's called monthly active users. You get free of charge 50,000 of monthly active users completely free of charge. So no matter how many licenses internally you have, you get up to 50,000 external users that you can license even if you have only 1 internal license available. That's the reason why I mentioned that if you have less than 10,000 internal licenses, then it's beneficial because you get 50,000 with this monthly active users. If you have more external users, then you pay the additional external users from this subscription that's linked here. Delegated admin partners are used when you have a partner relationship with some of the official Microsoft partners, for instance via CSP, and the partner sells you, for instance, some licenses, or they provide you some services. The old method it was used is something that was called delegated admin partners. Delegated admin partners always gave the partner organization full global admin permissions. And it's very important to mention it's the organization that gets the global admin permissions, not only specific users from the external partner organization. So it's then up to the external organization to have it under control and assign the permissions only to specific users who actually work with you. But even then, they have global admin permissions in your tenant, so they can do whatever they want. There are no restrictions. This was abused in something that's called supply chain attacks. It means that the partner organization, when they got hacked or breached, the threat actor not only got access to their internal environment, but through these delegated admin partners, the threat actor also got global admin permissions in your tenant. And that's very risky, as you can imagine. If you have some partners in this old delegated admin partner called DAP model, definitely you should talk with them and switch it to something that's called GDAP. The G stands for granular. It gives the granularity in terms of permissions. So they don't necessarily need global admin permissions, or if they don't necessarily need global admin permissions, they won't get global admin permissions. You can give them, for instance, only license administrator role if they are only managing licenses for you. For enterprise applications, there are some important settings as well. Let's go to consent and permissions. By default, all end users are able to consent to enterprise applications. What it means is that users can register enterprise applications. Through the enterprise applications, they can then access your cloud environment, the resources. Let's take an example here. Let me go back real quick. So for instance here, these are the enterprise applications I've registered in my tenant. And let's talk about these Apple Internet accounts. By default, all native Microsoft applications are already integrated. So if you use Outlook, OneDrive, Teams, the official applications, you don't need to do anything else. It's pre-registered in all tenants. But if you want to use some other email client, let's say, because that's the typical scenario, you need to first register the email application in your tenant. And that's this case, for instance, for Apple Internet accounts. The enterprise application of Apple Internet accounts is used when you want to use the Apple Mail client on your Apple devices like Macs and iPhones and iPads. The same goes with, for instance, the Gmail application on Android phones or the Samsung Mail client on Samsung phones. If you or your users want to use those applications for accessing email, they first need to register the application in the tenant. That's something you should control, because by default it's configured like this. All users are able to consent for applications. So whatever the users want to use, they are able to consent to it and register it in your tenant. And I very often see hundreds or even thousands of applications registered even in quite small organizations. And when we go through the list of registered applications, we usually see very weird things that definitely shouldn't be registered with Microsoft Entra ID tenants, because users can potentially register any application. We see things like Garmin registered in corporate tenants and other end user services or applications that should not be integrated with a corporate environment. So that's the reason why I recommend turning it off, so that end users are not allowed to consent for applications. What you can do then is you can allow users to consent, to request consent actually. So if you turn this on, users are technically not able to consent for applications, but they are able to request consent for applications. Then your administrators get the request and they have this amount of days to respond to the request. They can decide whether or not they want to approve it. If they approve it within this period of time, and the users can start using the application. If they don't approve it, they decline it or they just leave it expire, then the application is not registered in the tenant and end users cannot use the application. So that's my recommendation. Turn it off for end users, and if needed, just allow end users to request consent. If you already have a lot of applications registered here, my recommendation would be definitely to go through the list and disable those applications that are not needed or that you do not recognize. If you want to disable it, you can just open the application, go to Manage Properties, and here you can disable it. When you disable it, users will not be able to use the application any longer, but you can still re-enable it if needed. So my recommendation usually is like turn it off, wait like a month or 2 months, and if nobody starts complaining, you can delete the application. So the ultimate goal should be to remove all applications that are not needed for your business. There are some settings that you should also change for your devices. Users may join devices to Microsoft Entra ID needs to be turned on for most scenarios, because if you turn it off, all end user device join will be blocked. It includes also, for example, autopilot. So usually it's not possible because most of the autopilot scenarios are also user-driven scenarios. So it uses the join is in the user context, and it would have been blocked if you disable this. So it needs to be usually enabled. MFA should be required for device registration or device join. If you have Entra ID premium licenses, you should require MFA for device join and device registration via conditional access policies. So that's the reason why I have it turned off here, because I have a conditional access policy configured that requires MFA for device join and device registration. If you don't have conditional access policies because you don't have Entra ID premium licenses, then turn it on here. Maximum number of devices per user, I usually recommend setting it to unlimited. By default it's 20. I don't see any reason why it should be limited, because there is actually no reason for limiting it. Local administrator settings. By default, all global administrators are local administrators on all Entra ID joined machines. For small organizations, it's typically helpful. For large organizations, I usually recommend turning it off. The reason for that is that global administrators in large organizations are typically dedicated single-purpose accounts that are not used for anything else other than the cloud management, and they have other accounts that are used for device management. So then there is no reason for allowing global administrators to be local administrators on devices joined to Entra ID. The next setting is whether or not the user who is registering a device is also a local admin on the device. This is typically related to bring your own device scenarios when users are joining their personal computers to Entra ID to be allowed to access corporate resources, for example. I in general recommend turning it off because end users should never be local administrators on any device. But on the other hand, if it's a bring your own device, it's their personal computer, it's probably okay if they are administrators on the device. I would probably more think about if bring your own device is the right scenario for any organization. The next setting enables local admin password solution. Local admin password solution is a way how you can manage passwords of the local administrator accounts on your machine. If you turn it on, you can use Windows Labs that's integrated with Intune and Entra ID, and then the local administrator passwords are stored in Microsoft Entra ID. And the last setting here is for BitLocker recovery keys, whether or not you want to allow end users to access BitLocker recovery keys for their devices. I in general recommend blocking it so that only administrators are able to access BitLocker recovery keys. But again, for smaller organizations, it's typically okay if end users are able to access their BitLocker recovery keys. It just makes it easier. Enterprise state roaming is a way how users can configure some customizations on their computer, and the customizations will be then synchronized to other computers they own. It's very similar to the synchronization for personal Microsoft accounts that you can enable on Windows 10 or Windows 11 devices. This is just working over your corporate accounts. I don't see any problem with that. It's just a simple synchronization of things like the wallpaper, some colors, fonts, and so on. But this requires, this is one of the things that actually require Entra ID premium license. Then the next thing is mobility, mobile device management, mobile application management. If you have an old tenant, you probably still have also an application that's called Microsoft Intune Enrollment. This Microsoft Intune Enrollment application is not used any longer, so you can and should delete it. Now only Microsoft Intune application is used, and that's also the reason why new tenants have only Microsoft Intune and not the old Intune Enrollment. The important setting here is that there are two parts of the Microsoft Intune application. One is MDM and the other one is Windows Information Protection, or previously called MAM, Mobile Application Management. In most scenarios, you want to use Intune as the full device management service. That means that you need to enable it here, so either for some users or all users. But at the same time, you need to disable it for Windows Information Protection. So the same scope must be disabled here. So if you enable MDM for all users, then you should disable Windows Information Protection completely. The reason for that is that this Windows Information Protection has higher priority than MDM. So if you have both enabled, it will work in the Windows Information Protection scope. Then it gets us to properties of Microsoft Entra ID. There are two things I wanted to mention. One is that technical contact should be always configured, because in some cases Microsoft needs to contact you because of some reasons, and Microsoft uses this technical contact that you have filled in. In small organizations, it's typically the CEO or the IT personnel. For large organizations, it's always recommended to configure a shared mailbox or distribution list. Do not put one specific person here for large organizations, because if the person is on vacation or not available for whatever reason, you may miss something important. The other thing I wanted to mention here is the security defaults. If you have conditional access policies configured, if you have Entra ID premium licenses, security defaults are disabled. That's the case for my tenant as well. If you don't have premium licenses, security defaults is the way how you can secure your cloud environment. Because without conditional access policies, you don't have much control over the authentication process. And that's why there are the security defaults, because security defaults configures the recommended settings for your identities that are managed by Microsoft. So things like MFA will be required for all privileged roles. MFA will be required for some unusual authentication requests. MFA will be required for all admin portals, and so on and so on. It's very well documented here, so if you click the Learn More button, it will redirect you to the documentation where you can read more about security defaults and what it does. The last part of Microsoft Entra ID I want to talk about is the security part. It's actually one of the most important parts. I will skip conditional access policies for now, because there will be another video that will cover conditional access policies specifically, so stay tuned. But let's talk about the other settings that are available here. Authentication strengths. There are 3 built-in authentication strengths: phishing-resistant MFA, passwordless MFA, multi-factor authentication. Phishing-resistant MFA, there are 3 methods that are considered as phishing-resistant. It's Windows Hello for Business, it's passkeys, and it's certificate-based authentication. Then we have passwordless MFA. which adds one more authentication method, and that's the Microsoft Authenticator in the phone sign-in scenario, where users are not asked to provide their password, but they are confirming the authentication request directly on the phone. And the last built-in is covering all supported authentication methods, so including the password and SMS, password and voice, and so on. I recommend you creating custom authentication strengths. So for instance, I have one here. This one that I have here includes the most secure authentication methods available. So the 3 phishing resistant authentication methods plus the 1 passwordless multi-factor authentication method. And I also enable temporary access pass, but only in the one-time use scenario. And I also enable password plus Microsoft Authenticator in the push notification scenario. This will be for me the standard MFA requirement. So I don't want to allow any phone authentication such as the call or SMS or any other weaker way of authentication, including the one-time passwords. These authentication strengths can be then used in conditional access policies. So you can, for instance, have a conditional access policy for regular users that would require, for instance, this standard MFA, and then you would have a conditional access policy for your privileged accounts that would require phishing resistant MFA, for example. So this is the granularity you get with authentication strengths and conditional access policies. Now let's go to authentication methods. Here are all the policies that you can enable in your tenant. The important part of this is the migration. Microsoft, because at the moment probably your tenant still is in the pre-migration stage, which means that the legacy policies are still the source of truth for your tenant. Legacy policies are configured in the old legacy MFA portal, and also it applies to the self-service password reset that we talked about previously. The recommendation is to move towards modern policies, so this migration complete state, as soon as possible, and Microsoft will do it for you automatically no later than on the 30th of September 2025. You cannot go directly from pre-migration to migration complete. You need to go through this migration in progress. The reason for that is that in the pre-migration state, the source of truth for the authentication policies is still the legacy portals, the legacy configurations. If you change it to migration in progress, it allows you to use the new policies and the old policies side by side. It also enables you to turn off the policies in the legacy portals, which is actually the requirement in order to be able to go to the migration complete state. So if you are here on the pre-migration state and you go to migration complete and you click save, you would get an error message saying that you first need to turn off the authentication methods configured via the legacy options in the self-service password reset and the legacy MFA portal. And that's possible only in this migration in progress state. So first you need to go to migration in progress, turn off the legacy policies, and then you can go to migration complete. When you are in the migration complete state, you can fully configure the authentication requirements here via the policies. FIDO2 or passkeys are definitely recommended, so enable it for all users. Just make sure that self-service setup is enabled and enforced attestation is also enabled, but it should be enabled by default. Microsoft Authenticator also should be enabled for all users, and just make sure here that one-time password is disabled. I usually recommend disabling it because push notifications are more secure and also more convenient for end users because they don't have to type in any one-time password. They can just confirm the push notification and that's it. And also you should enable these 3 settings here. So show application name, it means that on the notification that users get in the Authenticator app, the application name that's triggering this request is shown on the screen. Geographic location means that, again, on the Authenticator notification, there is a small map showing the location of the request. The location is not based on any GPS coordinates. It's based on the IP address geographical information. So it will not be accurate unless you live in some large city. So it will mostly be just the country. So if you are trying to authenticate, for instance, from the Czech Republic, in my case, I'm okay if the request is showing like it's coming from the Czech Republic. I don't care what city it is in the Czech Republic, because that won't be accurate. But the reason for showing it is to show the users the suspicious request. So for instance, when I'm in the Czech Republic, anything that's within Czech Republic is okay. But if the request is coming from China, that's something that should ring a bell. And last setting here is Microsoft Authenticator on companion applications. That means that users don't have to necessarily use the Microsoft Authenticator application on their phone. They can use also Microsoft Outlook. So Microsoft Outlook can act as the Authenticator application. So the push notifications will be sent to the phone, not via Microsoft Authenticator, but via Outlook. And that's very user-friendly for end users, so that they don't have to install and register another application. They can just use Outlook that they probably already have. Oh, too much. Then SMS, I don't want to have enabled in my tenant, and I definitely don't recommend enabling it because it's one of the weakest MFA options. Temporary access pass is a thing how users can authenticate when they, for instance, are unable to perform the normal MFA. So let's say it's a new user in the organization and you want to allow them to securely enroll multi-factor authentication. That's the recommended way of using temporary access pass to register security information. You create a temporary access pass for a user account. You then send the temporary access pass, which is pretty much a generated password, to the end user, and then the user can use it for authentication. They use it instead of their password, and it also satisfies MFA requirement. So they just type in or paste the temporary access pass, and they don't have to know their password nor do MFA. My recommendation here is to limit the lifetime. I usually recommend something like 4 hours, not more, because that should be usually enough for end users to finish the thing they need, and it limits the potential exposure of the temporary access pass. And what's even more important, in my opinion, is one-time use. So when the temporary access pass is used, it cannot be used again. That's pretty much all for the policies. The rest of the settings here are usually not for most organizations. Let's talk about password protection here. The default lookout threshold of 10 unsuccessful attempts and lookout duration of 60 seconds in general is fine. I don't have any problem with that. What it means, and it's smart lookout. So what it means is that when there is a sign-in attempt that fails 10 times, the account will be locked for 60 seconds. But because it's smart lookout, the account will not be locked globally. So if there is something like a brute force attack on a user account, the account lockout is valid per Entra ID endpoint or Microsoft data center region, let's say. So if the password is happening in China, but your users are in the United States, the end users will not be affected because the account will be locked only in the data center region in China, not in the US. Also, the lookout duration is not static. So the more times you try, the longer the duration is. And Microsoft doesn't have this documented, and it's intentional. So Microsoft doesn't tell the threat actors how it works on the background. But the important information is that it's not static and it increases over time. So the more time you try, the bigger the duration is. The next thing you should configure here is the list of banned passwords. By default, there is the known weak passwords are banned automatically. And again, Microsoft doesn't publish this list publicly because it would give the attackers some kind of a guidance. So you don't need to worry about passwords like password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on. What you should put on the list here is the words that are somehow associated with your organization or the location of your organization. So what's typical, like the name of the organization or some acronyms that are related to the organization, or the city, the popular sports club in the city, and so on, because those are the words that users usually put to their corporate passwords. Threat actors know it, and that's what they also try when they are brute forcing or password spraying the accounts. So those words should be put on the list. You put one word per line, and the words should be in the base form, because Microsoft does all of the rotations and changes on the background. So you don't need to worry about capital letters, standard substitutions such as A with add and L with 1, 0 and O and so on. It's all done automatically by Microsoft. So simple words, one word per line. If you have on-premises Active Directory, you should also integrate password protection with your on-prem AD. There is a simple agent you install on your domain controllers. Then there is a simple proxy that you can install on the same server as Azure AD Connect, and that's all you need. Registration campaign is to push your users towards multi-factor authentication. So if there is a user who hasn't registered yet to MFA, the user will be prompted to register to MFA during the next interactive logon. The important is the interactive logon. So it doesn't show up in Outlook that's already signed in. It doesn't show up on any application that's already signed in. It shows up only on the applications that you are using for the first time. So during the first interactive authentication. If the account is not registered for MFA yet, the user will be prompted to finish the MFA registration, which is good and should be enabled. All users should be capable of MFA. Yeah, authentication strengths. And the last part here is report suspicious activity. During the authentication prompt over the Microsoft Authenticator app, or also the phone calls if it's allowed, which I don't recommend, by the way, users are able to report suspicious activities. So if there is an MFA prompt that the user didn't initiate, the user can then report the prompt as a suspicious activity. If you have Entra ID protection, the user risk will be increased, and your administrators can react to it manually, or you can have also conditional access policies to react automatically, such as require password change or log the account and so on. Because if there was an MFA prompt and the user didn't initiate the authentication, it most likely means that the credentials are compromised. It's good that the MFA blocked it, but on the other hand, you should act immediately. You should change or reset password immediately because it's compromised probably. System preferred multi-factor authentication is used when a user has multiple MFA methods registered. For example, the authenticator application, FIDO2 token, and let's say SMS. In general, users can choose their primary second factor authentication method. So even if they have like the FIDO2, which is the most secure method, they can still use SMS as the primary, the default method. With system preferred multi-factor authentication, the system on the background automatically chooses the most secure authentication method that the user has registered. So in this case of SMS, Microsoft Authenticator and Passkey or FIDO2, FIDO2 will be chosen because that's the most secure authentication method that the user has available. So it doesn't force users to register FIDO2 or even multi-factor authentication or something. No, it just chooses the most secure authentication method from the methods that the user has already registered. Definitely recommend it, because there is no reason for, or it should motivate and push the users from the less secure authentication methods to the most secure authentication methods. That's the general idea. And the very last thing I wanted to talk about today is the diagnostic settings here. Diagnostic settings allow you to collect logs from Microsoft Entra ID, and that's definitely recommended, because by default you have only, in general, 30 days of log storage in the cloud if you have P1 licenses, which is the most common scenario, and that's usually not enough. And also the graphical interface, or when you need to search the logs and when you are looking for something specific, or even when you are just overwatching it, the graphical interface of the sign-in logs and also audit logs is not very friendly, I would say. So definitely it's recommended to send the logs somewhere else, and preferably to some solution that enables you to work with the logs more effectively, I would say. So you can configure these diagnostic settings. Here on the left hand side, you can choose the log types that you want to send to the log storage. I would say at least you should always collect audit logs and sign logs. These are the most important log types or log categories. But if you have P2 licenses, you should definitely also collect all logs related to P2, which is the risky things. So risky users, risky sign-ins, risky service principal sign-ins, and so on. So all risky things. Ideally, you should collect everything. You just choose some diagnostic setting name. It can be literally anything because it's not shown anywhere. It's just for your reference because you can have multiple diagnostic settings configured. So it's just for your reference here in this diagnostic settings portal. And then you choose the destination. In most cases, it's the Log Analytics Workspace or Sentinel, which is the same thing, because that gives you the possibility of searching the logs using KQL. It's really fast, it's really admin friendly, so you can do a lot of things there. But you can send it also to other destinations, such as to a storage account, even hub, or even some partner solution. But I usually recommend sending logs to a Log Analytics Workspace. That was all from my side for these general recommendations on how to secure your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. I hope you liked it, and I'm looking forward to some new videos where I will show you more details, for instance, on the conditional access policies and other things that I usually recommend.